She was 19 years old, and her family had turned her out. She had no plan, no prospects, and $250 folded into a thin envelope. Just her grandfather's brass sextant wrapped in an old shirt and a train ticket west. And with 50 of those dollars, she bought a deed for a derelict lighthouse in the Arizona desert, 60 miles from the nearest town and 90 miles from the nearest drop of seawater. But what the county clerk who sold it to her didn't know, and what the family who cast her off would never learn, was that sealed away at the top of that impossible stone tower was a secret that would build her a new life from the dust. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Catherine Ward and the Sable Wells Light. We love to know where you're watching from tonight. Catherine Ward had been raised on the smell of salt and sawdust, even though she lived her whole life in a tidy house in Ohio. Her mother, a gentle woman with a quiet laugh, had passed from influenza when Catherine was only 4, leaving a void that was soon filled, but never replaced, by a stepmother named Eleanor. Eleanor was a woman of sharp angles and quiet resentments, a woman who managed a household with the grim efficiency of a quartermaster, and who saw in Catherine only a daily reminder of her husband's first and perhaps truer love. Her father, a kind but distracted man lost in his ledgers and accounts, had allowed the household to be shaped by Eleanor's cold gravity. But for 11 years, Catherine had a refuge. Her maternal grandfather, Elias Vance, had come to live with them. He was a retired ship's carpenter, a man whose hands were maps of a life spent at sea, calloused and scarred, but capable of the most delicate work. He smelled of pine tar and pipe tobacco, and his voice was a low rumble like the turning of a capstan. He took over the old workshop behind the house, and it became Catherine's true home. It was there, among the neat stacks of lumber and the orderly rows of hand tools, that Elias taught her everything that mattered. He taught her the names of the woods by their grain and their scent, the spicy bite of cedar, the sweet heft of oak, the pale utility of pine. He taught her how to use a dovetail saw so the cut was true and clean, how to sharpen a plane blade on an oilstone until she could shave a curl of wood so thin you could read a newspaper through it. He taught her how to mix plaster with horsehair for strength and apply it in a smooth, flawless coat with a steel trowel. He taught her patience. "The wood tells you what it wants to be," he would say, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You just have to be quiet enough to listen." He also taught her the sea. He'd unroll his old navigation charts on the workbench, the paper soft as cloth, and show her the soundings and the rum lines. He taught her how to shoot the sun with his heavy brass sextant, how to read the vernier scale and calculate a line of position. To him, the world was a thing of order, a system of knowable points and reliable forces, and he gave her that certainty as a gift. The sextant was his most prized possession, and when he died peacefully in his sleep the winter she turned 15, it was the only thing she asked to keep. Eleanor had allowed it with a thin, dismissive wave of her hand, as if granting a child a worthless toy. For the next 4 years, Catherine kept it on her bedside table, its polished brass a warm, solid presence in the chilled silence of the house. The ejection, when it came, was as quiet and bloodless as an entry in a ledger. A year after her father's sudden death from a heart ailment, on the morning of her 19th birthday, Catherine found a long white envelope on the polished hall table. Her name was written on it in Eleanor's precise, forward-slanting hand. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no scene of dramatic departure. There was only the rustle of thick paper as she opened it. The letter was from Eleanor's solicitor. It stated in cool, legal prose that with the passing of her father and her own attainment of legal majority, The estate was now settled. As she was not his biological heir, but a dependent, her residency in the house was concluded. Enclosed was a bank draft for $250, described as a final and complete disbursement meant to assist her in establishing her own household. It was a severance. She stood in the silent hallway, the letter in her hand, and felt not a shattering grief, but a strange, hollow calm. The house had ceased to be her home the day her grandfather died. This was merely the formal recognition of that fact. She did not cry. She did not plead or argue. She walked upstairs to her small room, the one that had been hers since childhood, and packed a single canvas satchel. She took 2 changes of sturdy clothes, her grandfather's whetstone, a small rigging knife, and a book of poetry her mother had owned. From the nightstand, she took the sextant, wrapping it carefully in one of Elias's old, soft flannel shirts before placing it in the very center of the bag, a solid weight to anchor her. She walked back downstairs. Eleanor was in the parlor, reading a book, and did not look up as Catherine passed the open doorway. She left the house key on the hall table, next to the vase of sterile, scentless silk flowers. She closed the heavy oak door behind her, the latch clicking shut with an irrevocable finality. She walked down the familiar street, past the manicured lawns and the silent, watching windows, and did not look back. At the train station, she bought a one-way ticket as far west as her money would comfortably take her. The clerk suggested a route that terminated in Arizona. Looking at the map, a place name caught her eye. A small, isolated dot in a sea of empty beige. Sable Wells. It sounded like a place where a person could disappear and begin again. She bought the ticket, her remaining money feeling impossibly thin in her purse. The train pulled out of the station an hour later, its whistle a long, mournful cry that sounded to Catherine exactly like freedom. The journey was a slow erasure of the world she had known. The lush, rolling green of Ohio flattened and faded, giving way to the vast, open plains of the heartland. The trees grew smaller and sparser, replaced by scrub and sage. The sky grew larger, a pale, immense bowl that dwarfed the clattering train. For 3 days, she sat by the window, watching the landscape shift and change, feeling the air grow drier, the light more intense. The heat pressed against the glass, a physical presence. Dust, fine as flour, worked its way through the window frames, coating the green velvet seats and her own hands with a fine reddish film. She spoke to no one, and no one spoke to her. She was simply a quiet figure in a plain dress, a ghost moving through a landscape of ghosts. When she finally disembarked at the small depot marked Sable Wells, the heat struck her like a physical blow. The town was little more than a single dusty street, lined with a dozen sun-bleached wooden buildings. A general store, a saloon, a land office, and a few shuttered storefronts. The air was still and silent, save for the hum of insects and the faint, rhythmic creak of a distant windmill. After securing a room in the town's only boarding house, a clean but threadbare establishment run by a tired-looking woman named Mrs. Gable, Catherine walked to the edge of town. There, on a low rise overlooking the immense, shimmering expanse of the desert, she saw it for the first time. It stood about a mile away, a stark, impossible silhouette against the bruised purple of the evening sky. A lighthouse. It was a perfect, classical structure, a tapering cylinder of pale stone rising 100 feet from the desert floor, capped with a glassed-in lamproom and a small widow's walk railing. It was absurd, a profound and lonely madness made real in stone and mortar. Yet, it wasn't pitiful. It looked defiant, stubborn, as if it had been built not in error, but as a deliberate challenge to the landscape itself. It drew her. The next morning, she walked to the county land office. The clerk, a balding man named Mr. Abernathy with ink stains on his cuffs, looked at her over his spectacles when she asked about the old Lighthouse parcel. He grunted. The Finch Folly? Worthless piece of ground. Unplatted, no water rights. Been on the delinquent tax rolls for 30 years. He told her the story as he knew it. Some eccentric sea captain from back east had built it decades ago, lived in it for a few years, then vanished or died. No one knew for sure. Taxes owed are $50, he said, a note of challenge in his voice, assuming she was just a curious drifter. Catherine slid the money across the worn wooden counter. I'll take it, she said. Mr. Abernathy stared, then slowly drew up the deed of sale. An hour later, Catherine Ward, owner of one useless lighthouse on 1 acre of sun-blasted rock, walked out into the desert to claim her inheritance. The walk to the lighthouse was longer and hotter than she had anticipated. The sun beat down, and the dry air leached the moisture from her skin. The structure grew larger as she approached, its scale becoming apparent. The stonework was magnificent. Large, roughly dressed blocks of local sandstone had been laid in precise, tight-fitting courses, the work of a master mason. It was built not just to stand, but to endure. The base was perhaps 30 feet in diameter, and weeds grew thick around it, their roots cracking the hard-packed earth. The great wooden door, made of thick planks of what looked like oak, had been bleached gray by the sun and was hanging from a single massive iron hinge. The other had rusted through, leaving the door canted at a drunken angle. She slipped through the gap into the cool, still air inside. The interior was a single, large, circular room. Dust lay thick as a blanket on the stone floor, and the air was heavy with the scent of decay and dry rot. Sunlight streamed in through several tall, arched windows, their glass long since broken out, illuminating swirling motes of dust. In the center of the room, a magnificent spiral staircase made of cast iron swept upwards, its filigreed railing disappearing into the shadows of the floors above. It was a ruin, but it was a good ruin. It had bones. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. Look at the bones of a thing first, Katie. A pretty finish can hide a rotten frame. The stone walls were solid, unbowed. The iron staircase, though rusted, was structurally sound. She placed a hand on the cool stone, feeling its solid, dependable reality. It felt more like home than Eleanor's polished, silent house ever had. She began a slow, methodical inspection. There were 4 levels in total, each a single circular room, smaller than the one below it. The second and third floors had wooden plank flooring, much of it warped and rotted through in places, but the main support joists, massive timbers set deep into the stone, were mostly sound. Each level had the same arched windows, framing rectangles of brilliant, empty blue sky. The plaster that had once covered the interior stone walls had crumbled away in great sheets, exposing the raw masonry beneath. It was a wreck, but Catherine saw not the decay, but the work to be done. She saw the shape of the life she could build here. With a growing sense of purpose, she began to climb the spiral stairs, her footsteps echoing in the vast silence. The iron treads rang with a clear, metallic note under her worn leather boots. As she ascended, the light changed, shifting through the narrow window slits that spiraled up the tower's wall. Finally, she reached the top landing, a small iron platform before a single, solid wooden door. This had to be the entrance to the lamp room. Unlike the main door below, this one was shut tight. There was no visible lock, but it was swollen in its frame, sealed by decades of heat and disuse. She pushed, but it wouldn't budge. She descended, found a length of rusted iron rebar in the debris on the ground floor, and carried it back up. Using it as a lever, she wedged the tip into the crack between the door and the frame and put her full weight into it. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, groaning crack that sounded like a cry of pain, the wood gave way. The door swung inward into a room that had not seen the light of day in half a century. The lamp room was a circle of thick glass panes set in a heavy iron frame. A fine gray dust coated everything, muting the intense desert light to a soft, submarine glow. In the center of the room stood a heavy stone pedestal where the great lamp and its clockwork mechanism must have once sat. The machinery was gone, but the base remained. And there, tucked against the curved wall beneath the windows, was a heavy, brass-bound sea chest made of dark, oiled oak. It was not locked. Her heart pounding with a slow, heavy rhythm, Catherine knelt and lifted the heavy lid. The air that rose from it was not the scent of dust and decay, but of cedar, salt, and old paper. Inside, nestled in neatly folded oilcloth, was a collection of rolled navigation charts, a thick, leather-bound logbook, a brass chronometer, and a small, heavy canvas bag tied with a sailor's knot. She untied the bag and poured its contents into her palm. 20 heavy gold coins, each a $20 double eagle. $400. A fortune that changed everything in an instant. Beneath the coins lay one final item, a thick envelope of yellowed paper, sealed with a blob of dark red wax stamped with the impression of an anchor. In a neat, deliberate script, it was addressed, "To the one who comes after." Her hands trembling slightly, she broke the seal. The letter inside was written on several pages of heavy, watermarked paper. The ink was faded but perfectly legible. "My name is Captain Alistair Finch," it began. "I laid the first stone of this lighthouse in the year 1887, and I write this entry in the year 1892, as I prepare to depart. If you are reading this, it means you had the tenacity to climb the stairs and the strength to open the door. It means this place has found its next keeper, and for that, I am grateful." Catherine read on, captivated by the steady, careful prose. Captain Finch told his story. He had been a master of a clipper ship in the China trade, a man who had spent 30 years of his life on the sea. He had married a woman named Isabel, and they had a daughter, Clara. On a return voyage from Macau, a fever had swept through the port of San Francisco where they had docked. It took both his wife and his child within a week. The sea, which had given him his livelihood and his identity, had delivered him to the place that took everything he loved. Broken, he sold his ship and his commission and traveled inland, as far from the sight and sound of the ocean as he could get. He bought this piece of land because the vast, silent expanse of the desert reminded him of the sea, but a sea at peace, a sea without memory or hunger. He built the lighthouse himself, with the help of 2 local stonemasons, as an act of penance and remembrance. "Some men build tombs," he wrote. "I built a light. I could not bear the thought of another darkness. I would stand here at night, in this room, and imagine a great sea stretching to the horizon. I would tend a light for a ship that would never come, for a harbor that did not exist. It was a comfort to me." He explained that he was now an old man, and his time was running out. He was leaving to find a place to die, a final voyage. "The money is what remains of my savings. Use it to make this place sound again. The charts are of my voyages. The logbook is the story of this tower's construction. They are all I have left. I leave them to you. A house is just stone and wood, but a home is a place that is tended. Tend the light, whoever you are. Keep a watch against the dark. I hope you find your own safe harbor here. He had signed it simply. A. Finch, Master. Catherine sat on the dusty floor of the lamp room, the letter in her hands, and for the first time since she had left Ohio, she wept. They were not tears of sorrow, but of profound, aching gratitude for the kindness of a stranger who had reached across 50 years of silence to offer her a home. The next day, Catherine Ward began her work. With Captain Finch's gold and her grandfather's lessons, she was no longer an outcast, but a builder. She walked back to Sable Wells, her satchel heavy with purpose, and went first to the general store. She bought canvas work gloves, a new hammer, a sturdy pry bar, and a set of chisels. She bought buckets, rope, and a block and tackle. She bought sacks of lime and fine sand for making plaster, and tins of linseed oil and putty for glazing windows. The store owner, a man named Henderson, watched her pile the goods on the counter with a curious eye, but asked no questions, simply tallying the cost. Her next stop was the lumberyard at the far end of town, run by a wiry, sun-weathered man in his late 60s named Silas Croft. She showed him a careful list of the lumber she needed: thick planks of Douglas fir for the floors, clear pine for the window frames, and cedar for new shelves. Silas looked at her list, then at her, his gaze sharp and assessing. "This is a serious order," he said, his voice raspy from a lifetime of sawdust. "For the old lighthouse?" Catherine nodded. "I'm restoring it." He chewed on a splinter of wood for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "All right," he said. "I'll deliver it myself, tomorrow morning." He gave her a fair price, a price for a local, not a transient, and Catherine knew in that small moment that she had been seen not as a fool, but as a person of serious intent. She started at the top, just as her grandfather had taught her. The lamp room. First, she cleaned. For 2 days, she hauled buckets of water up the winding stairs, scrubbing away 50 years of accumulated dust and grime from the glass, the iron frame, and the stone floor. She used the block and tackle rigged to the railing of the widow's walk to haul her supplies. The work was grueling, repetitive, and deeply satisfying. She found a rhythm in the simple physical tasks: the scrape of a wire brush, the splash of water, the squeak of a clean cloth on glass. When the room was clean, the desert light poured in, brilliant and clear, making the small space feel vast and airy. She carefully reglazed every one of the 16 large panes of glass, scraping out the old, cracked putty, setting the new glass against a bed of fresh putty, pressing in the small triangular glazing points, and then smoothing a final, perfect bead on the outside. It was the work Elias had taught her, and her hands remembered the motions perfectly. As she worked, she felt his steady, approving presence beside her. At the end of the first week, the lamp room was secure, weatherproof, and filled with light. It was her sanctuary. From there, she began her slow, methodical descent, floor by floor. The community, such as it was, began to notice. Silas Croft arrived the next morning as promised, his old flatbed truck groaning under the weight of the lumber. He helped her unload it, stacking it neatly inside the ground floor room. He had also brought a large stoneware jug of cold water, which he left on a crate. "Sun's a killer out here," was all he said before driving off in a cloud of dust. A few days later, a woman named Maria Esposito, who ran the small cafe in town, appeared at the base of the lighthouse around dusk. She carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "I saw the light in your window," she said, her smile warm and genuine. "I thought you might be hungry." Inside the basket was a bowl of hot beef stew, a thick slice of fresh cornbread, and a jar of peaches. From that day on, Maria came every other evening, bringing food and news from town. They would sit on the new wooden step Catherine had built, eating as the sun set, painting the desert in shades of orange and rose. Maria never asked about Catherine's past. She simply accepted her presence, her work, as a fact. One afternoon, as she was struggling to pry the rotted floorboards up on the third level, a man rode up on a horse. He was broad-shouldered, and his hands were stained with soot. He introduced himself as Jacob Hale, the town blacksmith. "Saw you were trying to fix this place up," he said, gesturing with his chin at the canted front door. "That hinge needs a forge, not a pry bar." The next day, he returned with his portable forge and anvil in a wagon. He spent the entire day at the lighthouse, heating, hammering, and shaping a new set of magnificent strap hinges, perfect replicas of the originals. He showed Catherine how the old iron had been folded and forge-welded, explaining the craft with a quiet pride. When he was done, he helped her rehang the massive door. It swung open and closed with a smooth, silent grace, and latched with a satisfying, solid thud. When Catherine tried to pay him, he waved her money away. "Good work is its own pay," he said. "It's good to see this place being cared for." Through these quiet, practical acts of generosity, Catherine felt herself being woven into the fabric of Sable Wells. She was no longer the strange girl who bought the folly. She was Catherine, the one who was fixing the lighthouse. Slowly, painstakingly, the lighthouse transformed from a ruin into a home. After securing the floors, she turned to the walls. She spent weeks mixing plaster in a large wooden trough, the lime and sand and horsehair blending into a smooth, heavy paste. Using a hawk and trowel, she applied it to the rough stone walls, working in long, even strokes, just as Elias had taught her. The circular rooms, once dark and crumbling, became bright and clean, the smooth white plaster reflecting the desert light. She built furniture from the leftover lumber, a sturdy table, a simple bed frame, long shelves for her few possessions, and for Captain Finch's charts and logbook. She installed a small, efficient wood-burning stove on the ground floor, its pipe running up through the center of the spiraling stairs, providing a gentle warmth on the surprisingly cold desert nights. The ground floor became her kitchen and workshop, the second floor her living space, and the third, her bedroom. The lamp room at the very top remained a place of quiet contemplation, a room for watching the sun rise and set over her vast, silent sea. Her life settled into a new rhythm, governed by the sun and the seasons. She rose at dawn, the first light painting the eastern mountains. She would climb to the lamp room with a cup of coffee and watch the desert awaken, the long shadows shrinking as the sun climbed higher. Her days were filled with work, not the frantic labor of initial repair, but the slower, more considered work of homemaking. She built a small garden at the base of the tower, coaxing tomatoes and peppers and herbs from the dry soil, watering them carefully from the well Jacob Hale had helped her dig. She read Captain Finch's logbook, tracing the story of the tower's construction, feeling a kinship with the lonely man who had laid each stone with such care. She unrolled his charts on her new table, following his voyages with her finger, from the Spice Islands to the coast of Peru. The world felt both immense and intimately knowable, People from town would sometimes ride out to visit, bringing mail or a pie, or just to sit for a while and talk. The lighthouse was no longer the Finch Folly. It was Catherine's Light, a landmark, a point of certainty in the vast, open landscape. Travelers crossing the desert began to use it as a guidepost, and she would sometimes find small gifts left at her door: a bag of flour, a bundle of dried jerky, a brightly woven blanket. She had come to this place with nothing, an outcast, and had found not just a home, but a purpose. She was the keeper of the light, a tender of a flame in the heart of the desert. One evening, as twilight settled, Catherine sat in the lamp room, the place where her new life had truly begun. The air was cool and clear, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the deep indigo sky. The desert floor below was a tapestry of soft, shifting shadows. The work was done. The lighthouse was whole, sound, and warm. It was filled with the quiet hum of a life being lived. On the simple cedar table she had built, two objects sat side by side. One was her grandfather's brass sextant, its arcs and lenses gleaming in the faint starlight. The other was Captain Finch's leather-bound logbook, opened to the first page. She thought of the two men, strangers to each other, separated by time and circumstance, who had both shaped her life. Elias Vance, who had given her the skills to build, and Alistair Finch, who had given her the place to build upon. Both were men of the sea who had taught her how to find her bearings in a vast and sometimes lonely world. She looked out through the clean glass at the immense, quiet landscape. She finally understood what the captain had meant when he called it a sea of memory. It wasn't empty. It was full of resilience, of things that endured the wind and the sun and the passage of time. The gnarled creosote, the stubborn cactus, the ancient weathered rock, they were all keepers of their own quiet light. She thought of Eleanor's cold, silent house, of the letter that had set her adrift. She thought of the $250, a sum meant to dismiss her, to erase her. It felt like a story from another person's life, a distant shore she had sailed from long ago. She had not been cast out. She had been set free. She had not been given a pittance. She had been given a chance. Here, in this impossible tower in the middle of the desert, she had navigated her way to a safe harbor, a place of her own making. Catherine Ward was 19 years old and had been sent into the world with $250. She spent 50 of it on a ruined lighthouse in the Arizona desert. It was the best $50 she ever spent. Thank you for joining us for Catherine's story. If her journey of finding strength and community in a place others had abandoned speaks to you, we hope you'll share it with someone who appreciates a story of quiet resilience. We leave you with this thought. What forgotten place in your own world, if tended with care and patience, might hold a light you never expected to find?